Hello and welcome to Scottish Planner Live, a series of 10 short online sessions transforming what was the RTPI Scottish Annual Conference. We have been running sessions all week, looking specifically at how do we plan for the healthier places in Scotland that we need. Places that we need because we have the poorest health record in the whole of Western Europe, and we're all very aware of what Harry Burns has been saying to us for years about the disparity in health and well-being across Scotland depending on where you live, and the fact is that that's actually worsening at the moment across Scotland. As planners, we've all been involved in this, and we know that that is very much a part of our input into the work that goes on in every place. We influence the physical aspect of place, but we do that in order to shape behaviour change, and we're also aware of how that links and impacts on economy and investment and jobs as well. So all very much linked in with planning, and today we are very specific on that role around active travel, so walking and cycling. What are the requirements around that? What can planners be doing around that? And what's the bigger picture around not just providing walking and cycling paths and infrastructure and routes, but the bigger picture around how we are actually creating our communities. Particularly in the lead up to this week, we've heard so much about the 20-minute neighbourhood and its impact. So I'm Irene Beautyman. I am the convener of RTPI Scotland in 2020, and I'll be joined today by a mixture of different sectors, which is really very welcome and very important, and expertise sharing their thoughts on active travel and what planning could be doing to contribute into that bigger picture of promoting more walkable and accessible communities. We'll be joined by Mike Morgan from Perth and Kinross Council, Ian Finley from Paths for All, and Susan Claris from Arup. As a little bit of background to where we've been in our journey this week, we've had real clarity on the need for planning and health to work together, given that the social determinants of health are identified as being where people live, work and play. What are the conditions and the impact of those conditions on keeping people well? This is not about treating them once they are unwell by the NHS. How do we prevent that from happening? So the programme has had strong support, stated at the very beginning of our week by the Minister, full support for 20-minute neighbourhoods, full support for planning's role in creating healthier places. We've also heard from Public Health Scotland, just set up this year, about their role and their desire to work in partnership with local government and with planning authorities to progress a healthier nation and to reduce the inequalities that we currently are experiencing in our country. We've looked at climate and sustainability, and we've really got to the bottom of feeling that health and achieving climate carbon emissions and reducing emissions and looking at air quality all knit together, which I think is a very welcome outcome that we have found. And then moving forward and looking at impact on health and the requirement that is coming our way through the new Act for us to assess the impact on health of national and major developments. We reviewed how the desire there is that we look at improving the impact on health of all developments, not just mitigating against the unintended consequences of what we may be doing, but let's start looking at what we can be doing across the whole of Scotland to improve the well-being and the opportunities for healthy lifestyles in the environments that we are creating. So today, as I say, we will be looking at active travel. Today's session, all of the sessions this week are being recorded, and indeed many of the sessions from earlier this week are already up on and available for you to view. At the end of this week, if you've been listening at all, you will have the link to all of those sent out to you. So if you miss anything today, or you're thinking, oh, I wish this person could hear this, then that link will come as a reminder to send it on and make sure that they catch up, or that you're able to catch up on sessions that you've missed. We will have an opportunity for questions in the latter part of this session, so I urge you, a Q&A box will come up when the presentations are ongoing. I urge you to get your questions in early. I anticipate quite a lot today, and we generally only manage to answer about 2, 3, 4, so my apologies if we don't manage to get around to them all, and I will try and group them as much as I possibly can. But please do get your questions in as soon as possible so that we can add to the discussion and that you can be part of that discussion. So without any further delay then, I just want to pass on to our first speaker to remind ourselves, this is us looking at active travel. How do we minimise the unnecessary travel that we have in our lives, and who needs to do what, and a particular emphasis. I know we have a lot of planners online, but we also have public health practitioners online. So there's that reflection for us all on what can we be doing to contribute into this bigger picture solution. So I'll introduce Mike Morgan. Mike, like many people I know these days, I first became aware of on Twitter because he tweets passionately about active travel. Mike is a Regeneration Projects Officer with Perth and Kinross Council, and I'm always delighted when I see a public sector, local government person out there pushing things forward, but it's great to then give an opportunity to get down to that nitty-gritty of what are we actually doing on the ground, what can be the role of local government, what can be the role of planning in pushing forward everything that we've been talking about this week. So Mike, I'll pass over to you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Irene. Morning, everyone. I'm going to discuss about the project we've got in Perth, the Untitled Roads Corridor. Just because I'm lazy and it's a bit of a mouthful, I'll refer to it as the DRC as I go through the presentation, and how we've used planning frameworks to get to this point. So what is it? It's 18 million investment in our city and people. It's a transformational approach to how our streets function, and it addresses this current status quo which fails everyone. So that's people in cars, buses, those who walk, use wheelchairs, bikes, and children. And this project is going to transform Perth. It's going to transform the way people move, and it's also going to challenge how we work. I'm sure you've probably seen this slide quite a lot this week if you've been tuning in or online, but essentially we haven't just kind of arrived at this point. You know, it's been a process getting to here, and we need to undo some of the work which we subsidise and plan for. The issue we have a lot of the time is we can't see beyond building roads. You know, we have to drive in order to protect our little ones. But the problem we have is over the last 4 decades, space for people has been eroded as vehicles have become bigger, and what we're seeing now is resulting in more conflict over finite space along our streets. And we have to question how we allocate the space in our streets going forward, and how efficient or effective we want to make them. And we have to ask ourselves how we've got to this stage, which basically is insanity, because we keep believing that more roads will address the issue, that EV cars are the saviour, that Uber and autonomous vehicles are the solution, but unfortunately, in terms of a spoiler alert, they're not. And we get what we design for. For 70 years, we've designed for the car. Our streets prioritise cars, and in effect, we've become car blind. So the time has come to change the question. Modern urban design is about how we move people, not cars, and what we do, or how we do that, is by giving people a viable alternative. Why do we need to do this? Well, quite simply, we're killing ourselves, and on the screen is a snapshot from Waltham Forest, a great scheme down in London. We've seen or heard about LTNs recently and the impact, and some local anger, inconvenience they're causing. But here you can see the impact that they had after 3 years, and how it made local neighbourhoods a lot more healthier, and actually the economic impact they had on businesses. So how do we tackle this from a planning perspective? We've got a number of policy frameworks in Scotland. These range from national, regional and local policy, and I've highlighted a number on the screen there. So from our perspective, national transport strategy, design of streets, economic strategy, cycle by design, along with the town centre action plan key documents for us to work with and how that's filtered down through the TAY plan itself, Tay Cities deal, and how that impacts on the Perth LDP, the Perth Transport Future, recently updated city plan, and the Perth Cycle Network Master Plan. So in terms of Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan, we have four kind of key elements or outcomes we're looking at. One, a successful sustainable place, low carbon place, natural resilient place, and connected place. And I'll just focus on 3 areas in this presentation. Just wanted to highlight some of these successful sustainable place, the policies we look at in terms of placemaking per city, but also the city transport and active travel. And then from a natural resilient place, linking in the likes of Perth Aid, which is going to be a key component of the DRC going forward, ensuring that we have key links across the city, but also biodiversity and green infrastructure and how these fit in to the DRC. We're not looking at it as just a cycle corridor, we're looking at working in collaboration with the likes of Scottish Water and how we can work with them to manage stormwater better going forward and minimise the impact that has on communities. And then there's connected place in terms of transport, how we connect people and move people around Perth and Kinross, and then focus on the city itself. So moving on from LDP, we have Perth Transport Future, which focus on infrastructure around the city to the north and west, where we're focusing on developments, so the likes of Perth Park, Perth West, Scone and Lunkerty as well. We're looking at potentially up to 10,000 new homes in the next 25 years. But what we can't have is all of those driving into the city centre. So we have an updated Perth City Plan, an agenda for change, and how that links in with the development of the city, but also tapping into the growth on the outside. Touched upon earlier how we give people a viable alternative. We need to start, I believe, we need to start taking cycling as a form of transport seriously in the UK, especially over short journeys. And that led us on to the development of the Perth Cycle Network Master Plan. A couple of snapshots here. So we highlighted the thematic scheme linking into key trip generators. We got barriers, opportunities, and how that links into both the city to the north and west. And we're looking to align these to key transport corridors coming into the city centre. That led us to the development of a 50-kilometre network. You have 7 key corridors, and you have 3 different options for routes along each corridor. In terms of the DRC, it was about reducing domination of motor vehicles, giving redundant space back to people, removing barriers and creating better communities. This led to a submission to Sustrans back in 2019, actually last year, time flies. But it's also about making our streets more inclusive and accessible to all. And in terms of the strategic corridor itself, the DRC, on the back of the funding we're having from Sustrans, we're looking at a 10-kilometre route from the north of the city through the city, linking in with the likes of schools, key employment sites, bus stations, and the train station itself. But what is all of this going to look like? Because we tell people we're doing all this work, and usually we struggle to visualize what this is going to be, but it's going to be completely different to what it is now. Our streets are going to be designed for people. Street users will be given their respective space. Our transport corridors will be fit for purpose, and they'll move people through a variety of transport modes. Our residential streets will be designed for local residents and not commuters. And we'll be using modal filters to remove through traffic and rat runs and establish quiet streets, again similar to the model successfully implemented down in Waltham Forest and what you're seeing in Hackney as well. Our streets will also become more resilient for future climate. Warmer climate means drier summers and wetter winters, and we need to design our streets so they become cooler and also delay the rainfall or the transfer of rain to the sewer network. And again, that's where we're looking to collaborate with Scottish Water on this. We're also looking at opportunities for children. We need to give our streets back to people, opportunities for children to be children and play in the streets as we used to. We're working with organisations to develop opportunities for communities to create better neighbourhoods. We've also worked with local schools, young children to identify local issues we can design out. We worked with young adults, students, local students, to overcome barriers in active travel and give them an opportunity to make their mark in the city centre. Because ultimately, it's their future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic. I love that starting point of we just need to change our question, and we need to allocate space for people to move, not for cars to move. That just really encapsulates it. It's also, you know, all of the changes there that you say, and the creating of space for people, and a lot of our current urban areas, and people say, well, how can you retrofit anything when we all, you know, the majority of our areas already built? It is that fact that so much of our urban areas, the percentage is it 60–70% is taken up by space for cars rather than space for people, and it does need to be space for cars and people. Having grown up in Perth, playing out on the street was a major part of my life, and I've been aware of bringing up children in Edinburgh who haven't been able to do that, or weren't allowed to by me, through a perception of safety and the through traffic right outside my door. I think that sets us off in a really good practical, here's what we can actually be doing, and here's the level that sits within a local development plan that is supporting that, and I'll be interested in the discussion just to see how much that LDP policy helps and what more it could potentially go on and do in the future as well. I'm going to come on now to Ian Finley, who is the Chief Officer at Paths for All. I'm beginning to sound like I spend my life on Twitter, because again, I initially met Ian on Twitter because we were always retweeting the same things and commenting and in agreement, but then we did actually meet physically after that. It's not just been purely through Twitter. The work of Paths for All in realising how to achieve a happier and healthier Scotland, and that it goes beyond simply encouraging people to make a change for a few weeks, that we need to embed this in people's lifestyles, is what I find a holistic approach to what we're talking about in embedding healthier places. So I shall pass over to you, Ian. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
Great, thank you very much, Irene, and good morning, everyone. Yes, Twitter is a great thing. So I hadn't met Mike, who's just been speaking before, and I hadn't met Susan, who's going to be speaking after me, other than through Twitter. So yeah, Twitter's great. So firstly, a big thanks to RTPI for inviting me to take part in this session. I'm not going to say anything about Paths for All. I'm assuming most of you who are listening know a bit about Paths for All, but just in case there's anyone who doesn't, there's a web link there to Paths for All's website, and you get information there. So I've only got 10 minutes, so what I've decided to do is to keep this strategic. I'm going to focus on a number of what I feel are key challenges and concepts for the planning system, for planners, in relation to active travel. I am going to start with a disclaimer, because I'm going to keep it strategic. I am going to make generalisations. I think the generalisations hold well, but they are generalisations, and I appreciate that it's not one size fits all. A very good example of that is there's differences between the urban and rural context. I'm going to start with a quote from the internationally renowned urban planner Brent Tadarian. The best transport plan is a great land use plan. And in some ways, that's my main take-home message that I hope you will take away. The planning system, yourselves as planners, have a huge impact on the transportation system and the way in which we move goods and people around. And that applies to active travel as much as any other part of the transport system. So I think you do have a key role to play in helping to deliver active travel outcomes. And I think one of the key concepts, which I think is extremely useful for planners in the planning system is the transport hierarchy. Now, you'll have all seen the transport hierarchy before, and there's many, many versions of it. This is the version that's actually in the National Transport Strategy for Scotland, and that strategy puts great weight on the transport hierarchy and the need for all public policy and delivery to follow this hierarchy. So you can see it starts with wheeling and walking, then cycling, public transport, taxis and shared transport, and at the very bottom, the private car. And I think from a planning perspective, and this builds on what Mike has just been saying, one of the key priorities is to move us all, and I say us rather than them because I'm talking about you and me as well, is to move us out to the private car, to create choices that we don't need to use the private car and that we can move up this transport hierarchy. So for short everyday journeys, we can walk, wheel and cycle. And for slightly longer journeys, we can use public transport, which involves walking, cycling and wheeling at the beginning and the end of it. So I think a key filter, a key tool for planners in the planning system is this transport hierarchy. I mean, the planners, you can make strategic walking, cycling and wheeling networks. Planning can also make walking, wheeling and cycling safe, easy, pleasant and comfortable. The simple things like toilets, drinking water, resting areas, shade and shelter and signage. So I think there's a lot in which the planning system and yourselves as planners can do to contribute to moving us all up this transport hierarchy. A couple of challenges relating to the hierarchy, and Irene at the very beginning mentioned the 20-minute neighbourhoods, and I see a couple of days ago one of the presentations, one of the seminars was on 20-minute neighbourhoods. I think localism is extremely important. It's great to see it having such prominence now. 20-minute neighbourhoods, the 15-minute cities. And it's all to do with localism. It's all to making sure that what we need as people, services and goods, and just what we need to live, is as close as possible. I think it's about 10 years now that Pastoral has been talking about the importance of accessibility rather than mobility. And if I'm being slightly unfair in some ways, I think we've focused too much on mobility. A good example is out-of-town shopping centres. It doesn't matter if it's 2 or 3 miles out of the town, because as long as we make good road networks so that people are mobile and can get to that shopping centre, then it's fine. We've argued the opposite, that accessibility is more important, and making sure that all our goods and services are accessible and local is really important. So it's fantastic to see localism right now at the very top of the agenda, mentioned in Programme for Government just a couple of weeks ago. Another challenge is to avoid unintended consequences. Yeah, we want to make sure that we create infrastructure that is really good for active travel, but in so doing, we want to avoid unintended consequences. And a couple examples of that. One is we don't want to exacerbate inequalities. So when we're building active travel infrastructure, we mustn't just think of those who are active already and encouraging people to walk, wheel and cycle more who are already doing it. The focus should be on those who are not walking and wheeling and cycling, and making sure that we bring them on this journey, so to speak, as well, so that we create active travel infrastructure that's suitable for everyone and we don't exacerbate inequalities. Another unintended consequence we need to be very aware of is that we don't make life more difficult for people with disabilities by providing active travel infrastructure. We want to avoid making it more difficult and impossible for people with disabilities to move about. In fact, we want to do the opposite. We want to make it easier. But that it can be another unintended consequence of well-intentioned and good active travel infrastructure projects. And the final one is displacement. Be aware of displacement. A good example that comes to mind is say schools. And if children and teachers and other staff in the school are walking to school, then maybe we don't need to encourage them to cycle. And vice versa. If people are already cycling, then it doesn't matter. We don't need to focus on encouraging them to walk. Again, with public transport, if people are using one mode of public transport, then that's good. We don't need to put a lot of effort into converting people to another and simply displacing people from one form of more sustainable travel to another. As I said at the beginning, the top priority is to encourage all of us and create an environment for all of us to choose not to use the private car as much as we're doing. Another concept, I know this is about active travel, but I want to mention public transport because public transport is incredibly important in terms of delivering active travel objectives. This is just one result from a survey which Path for All did, funded by Transport Scotland last year, on attitudes and behaviours to walking. And you can see there from the stats just how important public transport is in delivering active travel outcomes. Over half of adults reported that they walked as part of a public transport journey. And that goes up to almost 3/4 for young people. And here again, I think planners have a key role to play because the public transport journey is not just about the bus trip or the train trip. It's the journey to and from that public transport. It's a multimodal journey, and improving routes, improving signage, improving information, all things that fit within the planning system can make public transport more attractive and go back to the hierarchy, encourage us not to use the private car. Final concept, which I want to just mention, is that we are, I think, looking at system change here rather than just technology change. System change is being mentioned in all contexts now. Public health, it's anchored within the transport strategy, and we need to look at system change rather than simply technology change. A good example, and this is a generalisation, is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles definitely have a place in our transport system moving forward, and the fuel that electric vehicles use is much more sustainable than, say, conventional vehicles. But in many situations, using an electric vehicle can just be doing the wrong thing better. In that an electric vehicle still has a huge environmental impact in terms of its creation. It doesn't help with congestion. It doesn't help in terms of pollution. This is a study from Europe, from European Environment Directive, on microplastics in the sea around the European coast. And you can see that most microplastics are produced by road travel, private cars, tyre dust being by far the biggest. And so an electric vehicle doesn't change that. So they do have a place, but we must avoid situations where they are just simply doing the wrong thing better and think about the whole system, which again is where planning comes in, because planning is all about systems and systems change. So I'll go back to where I started with this quote from Brent. If I had to think about which profession probably has the most to contribute in terms of active travel development, one of the professions at the top of my list would be the planning profession and the planning system. I think there's a huge opportunity with the planning system and with yourselves as planners to accelerate the amount of active travel and to accelerate the travel for all of us up this transport hierarchy which I talked about. So that's walking and cycling for everyday short journeys, public transport for longer journeys. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Very useful reflections there on the role of localism being so crucial, and that aspect around even where it's public transport, it's the walk to get to public transport that's so important. And I think it's just highlighting, pulling out even what Mike had with that, the obesity, inactivity, depression and loss of community. We didn't plan it. But it happened. It was an unintended consequence that happened as a result of us actually building in and building for cars and delivering for cars rather than for that kind of the benefits on our health of getting out and being that little bit more active. And I've quoted already this week, Melbourne has said that where they have established a 20-minute community and people are out and being more active in their travel, they're walking for 49 minutes a day on average. Where they haven't, people are walking 7 minutes a day on average. And that's immense when we're here talking about planning and health, that's the bit that matters, because that walk is what means that you're physically active, but it also has massive impact on your mental health as well. And mental health then has big impacts on when it comes to substance abuse and depression and all of those aspects as well. So it's part of that bigger picture, and we know that there are other things that influence that for a person, and we are, as you say, we're in the generalities today, but it's an important part of it. So I'm interested with that then to pass on to Susan. Susan Claris works as a transport planner in Arup, but I was interested that she's also an anthropologist, which is a really fantastic perspective to bring into transport planning. And Susan has a particular interest in what we're talking about today, the walkability of an area in order to create more sustainable communities. So I'll pass over to you, Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I was just trying to make sure my microphone was okay there. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to come along today to talk about how planners can prioritise active travel. I always like having some personal photos in my slide deck. So this is my partner's niece and nephew. And I think if we can create streets where children can happily walk along the road, we're doing a good job in terms of active travel. So what I want to do to talk about today is to have some stats about the journeys we make, because I think it's always a really important starting point in discussing active travel. Then to briefly go over some of the benefits of walking and cycling. Probably most people are familiar with those, but I think it never harms to restate them. And then talk about some actions and case studies. So if we look at the journeys we make, this is data that was recently published by the Transport Scotland. The link to it is in the slides there, so this came out last month. And these are how we travel at the moment. So you can see driving by car and van is still dominant and has actually gone up by 5 percentage points over the last 7 years. Walking is a very important mode, but has decreased over the last 7 years, which is not good to see. And actually, cycling doesn't even feature on that chart. I assume it's because it's below 1%. But as I said, that's the data. Don't blame me for this one. That's the data as it's presented in the document. So bus at 7%, rail at 2%. And has been said, walking and cycling are a really important aspect of those public transport journeys. And I think this one is always really important to remember as well, is that the most common reason for traveling is shopping. The whole thing about everyone's going to be shopping online and no one is going to be going shopping, and this was all obviously pre-COVID in terms of the data, but shopping is still the most important journey purpose. And I think as planners and as transport planners, we tend to focus too much on the commuting journey, on the journey to work, because that's what we do. We don't focus enough on the shopping, the leisure, the visiting friends or relatives, the local journeys. We focus too much on commuting peak hour, and it's those local journeys that are really well suited to walking and cycling. And if we look here at journeys under 2 miles by walking, you can see that just under a half of all journeys under 2 miles are made by walking, which is good news. But you have over a third, the box in the right there, made by car and van. So there is a lot of potential for more journeys to be walked, and even more so when we look at cycling. So journeys under 5 miles by bicycle, the bottom image there, is only 2%. And you've got nearly half of them done, those journeys made by car and van, 44%. So there is a lot of potential. And the thing with cars is, and this is Great Britain figures, we are using them more. We are buying them more, but we are using them less. So the graph on the left shows the increase in the number of licensed vehicles in Great Britain over the last 20 years. And you can see that it's gone up from something like 27 million to 37, 38 million. So a massive increase. But the actual mileage we do in them has gone down from, in 2002, it was just over 9,000 miles a year, to 2018, only 7,600 miles per year. Which in some way you can say it's good if we're using them less, but it's incredibly wasteful to have this machine that costs thousands of pounds that we're not using and that actually we're parking in public space. So if a car is doing an average of 7,600 miles per year, that's 20 miles per day. So that's why we can see it is parked for the majority of the time, and there's lots of tales of cars being parked for 96% of their time. And also, the other thing to flag is the rising use of large vehicles in urban areas. So in Europe, 1 in 3 cars sold now is an SUV. And an SUV is twice as likely to kill people walking because of the higher size and where it hits the person. It emits more particulates because it's bigger and heavier. It takes up more space. There's anecdotal evidence that people who drive them less safely because they have a sort of tank mentality. They feel safe inside their vehicle. And there's a growing evidence of a link between pedestrian fatalities and engine size. So all of this has an impact on active travel. So just to briefly go over the benefits of walking and cycling, I said, because I think it's always really important to remember those. And I tend to start off with the economic benefits because they tend to be the most compelling with the sort of people that I talk to about active travel. And I think the key one there is that there is now strong evidence emerging that people who walk to high street spend 40% more than car drivers. Over the years that I've been working in transport, it's always, oh, we must have car parking, otherwise someone will go to the next town. But it's the people who walk there who spend more money. And the bottom one there, that high street walking, cycling and public realm improvements can boost retail sales by up to 30%. And I think that is really what we need with the way high streets are struggling at the moment. Also strong economic benefits for business, not quite so relevant when we're working from home, but people who walk to work report greater job satisfaction. And the one at the bottom is that employees who are physically active take up to 27% fewer sick days. Now, from any company, if you could say I could reduce your absenteeism rate by more than a quarter, those businesses will want to know how. And okay, if we're working from home, maybe it's about giving employees encouragement to actually make sure they walk and cycle as part of their day, to get out during their day to keep active. There are the social benefits for people in terms of more social interaction between neighbours if there are lower traffic speeds, less traffic. There's public realm benefits in terms of parklets, so it makes it safer places for everybody. The health benefits we've discussed, if it's actually about building exercise into people's daily routines, and also if you have more, reduce the number of motor vehicles, there's lower levels of air pollution. And I always like using this graphic from Public Health England. And as Irene said, it isn't just the physical benefits, it's the mental health benefits. So it reduces the incidence of depression by 48%. And we're talking here sort of 2 10-minute bursts of activity a day, a brisk walk or a cycle. And that's a much better way of getting physical activity into people's lives than going to the gym, etc. So really strong benefits. And the climate benefits as well, reducing carbon emissions and also having space for street trees, rain gardens and things. So what to do and some case studies, and this fits very well with Ian. I'm glad to see we have the same pyramid. I have the walking and wheeling at the top as well, and the cycling, public transport. I think the only difference is I've put in the servicing vehicles and the private vehicles at the bottom. But I'm increasingly of the view that as well as putting walking and cycling at the top, we have to control what I refer to as transport gluttony. So that's things like increasing use of SUVs in urban areas, parking on footways, engine idling, going through red lights, inappropriate speeds. All of these things need to be controlled. So as well as putting walking and cycling first, we need to have those 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. We need to have those parking controls. And I think we need to have people actually paying to use the roads to encourage walking and cycling for short journeys. And the importance of being inclusive, as has been mentioned. So we've just recently done a piece of work with SUSTRANS, which looks at underrepresented groups in cycling, which are women, older people, people from ethnic minority groups, disabled people, and people at risk of deprivation. That image there I took a couple of weeks ago. I was based down on the south coast of England, small seaside village. 8:30 in the morning, went out to get some milk, and these two women were just sitting there having a chat, and I thought that is just what active travel should be about. One woman has a tricycle. I asked if I could take their image, and they their photo, and they kindly let me. So the piece of work we've just done with SUSTRANS is about encouraging cycling and walking for everyone. And it says what we need to do is we need to increase representation in governance. We need to embed inclusivity in walking and cycling strategies. We need to create better places for everyone to walk and cycle, and we need to welcome and support all people to cycle. And the link to the report is there. So to finish with some case studies, it's important about embedding active travel in our projects at all levels. So it can be at the large master plan level, the example here of Meridian Water in northwest London. And this put healthy streets at the heart of the proposals. The circular image there is TfL's 10 indicators of a healthy street. And it's about having those mixed uses. But it's also important at the street level. The example of Bold Street in Liverpool, where parklets have been put out in outside bars and restaurants to enable people to socialise, to actually go to those bars and restaurants, but to keep a distance. And I know that Mike is a big fan of parklets as well. So it's at the master plan level, it's at the street level, it's also at the public transport level. Ian was talking about the amount of walking and cycling that's done in association with public transport. So, for example, we've been doing work at Edinburgh Waverley Station to improve active travel. So that includes pedestrianising one of the main streets fronting the station, segregated cycle lanes, and putting in cycle parking spaces. And again, it's important that those cycle parking spaces are inclusive. And it can be combined with other interventions such as drainage. And I think I spotted this image in Mike's presentation, which is great. So this is Greener Grangetown in Cardiff, where there was integrated sustainable urban drainage such as rain gardens, modal filters, traffic calming, pedestrian crossings, public improvements, and Wales's first cycle street. And it was very much a community co-design approach, and that enables more active modes. So it started as a drainage study. And it's really important in terms of connecting the places. So the example here of the Conswater Community Greenway in Belfast, which was 16 kilometres of cycle and walkways with a new 9-kilometre linear park. And that allows residents to travel across the city easily via car-free corridors. So that supports cohesion, economic development, etc. So that's my 10 minutes. I just seen Irene pop up as a reminder, but I'm done in my 10 minutes, so thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you so much, Susan, and for those examples at the end. I think it's really helpful to see that the practical examples, but it's as if you were reading my mind with your pointing out about the actual impact that having these the walkable and cyclable and access to public transport is having on our mental health and on our physical health and on our economies as well. And I'm interested in that example that you gave of the 30% impact on retail. I'd like to know what that study is, because certainly we're looking at that within Public Health Scotland at the moment about that impact as we recover from the lockdown and mitigate what's happened as a result of the pandemic. I noticed comments there about the fall in fuel sales being an indicator that we have shifted in our travel modes while we've been on lockdown. I think we've all been aware of that and done it ourselves, but I know that there is a concern around that reversing as soon as things start to lift, and that there has been evidence of people going back into cars even more so because they feel safe in their metal box. So there's something more there to consider. On reflecting from what everybody said, there's a lot there about road reallocation, really. The space that is taken up by cars being reallocated to give more of a priority to people. So I wonder about all of your reflections on that for what more planning can do within planning policy to enable that to happen more. And then also I wonder about when we're looking at change in a community, what are we doing in respect of density? Something that I've certainly been involved in is looking at that 20-minute neighbourhood and the need to get a sweet spot of density, not really high density that we know didn't work in the past, but that the current 30 to 35 hectare fields of family housing means that people don't walk to a shop, because the distance they would have to travel means that the shop doesn't even open. It doesn't even set itself up as a business because people simply won't walk to it. They'll get in their car, and once in their car, they'll drive onto the retail park rather than to the local shop that may have a more limited choice. So I just wonder from each of you first, since I'm just going to ask my own question to begin with, what are your reflections on what more planning can do when it comes to that road reallocation to make it more for people, and what also could it be doing when it comes to achieving that sweet spot of density when we're looking at change and at new areas on the edge of towns being developed to ensure that we get a kind of a critical mass of people and mix. So I shall just, I'll go in reverse order. So Susan, and then Ian, and then to Mike. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the key ones is always parking. If it is not easy for people to park somewhere, then they're not going to drive somewhere. So I think it is absolutely about restricting parking, and that will be key. So that isn't so much in terms of reallocating road space, but it's in terms of actually lowering traffic levels overall. And then I think it's the recognition that the majority of the built environment is already there, and we need to focus on how we retrofit our existing developments, which has been built around sort of car dominance for the last 50, 60 years. So I think that's the key role for planning in terms of what we do with our existing areas, and we're seeing a lot of that happening with some of the low traffic neighbourhoods where we see gyratories being taken out, being replaced with infrastructure that's more suited to walking and cycling. So for me, it really is focusing on that retrofit, and that's a key way of doing it. And we've seen some very powerful examples of road reallocation in London with key roads like Park Lane, Euston Road, really major roads in London, having a whole lane taken out to put in cycle lanes. And I think that's a really powerful message. And in terms of the density, it's interesting, all the discussions about the 20-minute or 15-minute neighbourhood, because I mean, I see all of that as going back to the garden village concept, and then the sort of the new towns. And it's like each time there's been some dreadful global event that has triggered this way of thinking. I said whether it was the garden village after the sort of the First World War and the Spanish flu, and then after the Second World War we had the new towns, and now it's being talked about again. And they're different names, but it's very similar principles. And I think we need to look at why some of those earlier examples didn't work. So if you take somewhere like Stevenage, for example, or Hemel Hempstead, classic sort of new towns, somewhere like Stevenage has got great walking and cycling infrastructure, and it's not used. And the reason it's not used is because it's got that highway capacity. So I think it's really important that we learn from the lessons of previous places.
Yeah, if I could pick up on the latter point, the density point, just one reflection. Looking at the travel hierarchy which I presented and that Susan presented, of course, there's a bit at the top that was missing that's become much more relevant now, and that is not to travel in the first place, and to try and create communities and infrastructure that mean that we don't have to travel in the first place. So my reflection on density is we need to think about, I don't like the new normal. I prefer, someone mentioned the next normal rather than the new normal. I think I prefer the next normal coming out of COVID-19. But I think the way we think about density may well need to change, because especially for those of us who are lucky to work from home, and I suspect the majority of people on this call are doing that today, the way we and the reasons for travel are going to fundamentally change, I think. I don't think we will go back to the way we travelled before, especially for business. And so the way we think about density might also need to change, and creating community work hubs and all of this sort of thing might allow higher density, but density that doesn't need to travel about quite so much.
Thank you. And finally on to Mike.
I guess there was two angles I was going to come from. I guess one, leadership. I think that's key, actually. Having a kind of vision to see something different. But also street design. One thing we were keen when we did the DRC and the bid for Sustrans was to kind of go and see best practice. And Susan knows in terms of Greener Grangetown, the street design you got there, but also in Sheffield with the Greater Green and how they've incorporated SUDs and management of stormwater into streets. And I think it's just engaging in better places for people, making them more attractive to actually walk along, make them more inclusive and accessible, because the majority of our street design in the UK is actually quite poor and boring. We often see CGIs of high street developments, and it could be anywhere. Really, they're all the same. They focus on hard landscaping, a couple of trees, and that seems to tick the box. So I think we can come up with significant opportunities to address the challenges we face.
Thank you, Mike. And I know that actually going to physically see what is happening can be very powerful, and you did that yourself. And I was aware of in West Dunbartonshire, they did that also when they were looking at a fresh ski development. They went and had a look at the King's Cross area in London, because when you actually see it and feel it, it really brings it to life, and it starts to actually breed in that passion in everybody to deliver something different. I'm noticing our questions. There's one about how do we convince retailers that they don't need that parking outside their shops. I think really what you said there, Susan, about, you know, the 30% extra spend that they can get, I think there's a need for a little bit of promoting that so that retailers are aware of, there's evidence there. That's certainly something also that I'm looking at in Public Health Scotland, is how do we show that evidence and give that confidence that is actually what happens. An interesting one there about the public opposition to measures to restrict cars and support active travel. I wonder what your thoughts are around how do we turn on that. My own thoughts are the fact that where Ian was talking there about we need to be thinking about everybody and the inequalities that we have in access to get to move around our areas. Is there an inequality there that we need to pull on as a reason for why we're reallocating space for people rather than for, I also find it better to call them metal boxes because it detaches us all from this, oh, it's my car kind of thing. It's a metal box we store in a public area. So just passing on to everybody for a reflection on what do you feel we can do to deal with that desire that people have to get into the car and to turn that around, and how can planners help with that when they're out and speaking to communities and drawing up their local development plans. I'll go in reverse order. You just don't know who's first, do you? Mike and then Ian and then Susan. Thank you.
Right, okay, so quickly in terms of retailers, we put in 12 parklets across Perth. We had a bit of stick on the one scheme of the high street, but the way we looked at it is a kind of test and adapt. It didn't work in one place, but businesses came to us elsewhere, so we've moved them around and they've seen some success. I think in terms of public opposition, I would actually kind of counteract that. Often it's the minority, a vocal minority. We all know team to get kind of highlighted in local media, but when we did a DRC bid, we went out, we used Commonplace. I think we engaged with like 4,000 people and we had 66% people wanting to see these things. When we worked with Sustrans and did Bike Life Perth, 69% of people wanted infrastructure, even if that meant a reduction in carriageway space. So I think what we need to do as authorities is kind of use that messaging a bit more. To get out there, and that's where I come back again, I suppose, to governance and leadership. It's turning around and saying, actually, the status quo is failing a lot of people, including retailers. You know, our high streets have to adapt and change, and that means looking beyond the car. Ultimately, people spend money, not cars.
Lovely, thank you, Mike. I like that idea of, you know, go and ask all of the people rather than waiting for the minority who will be very vocal in their thoughts. Ian?
Yeah, how to overcome public opposition to restricting car use. It is a difficult one because we've done superbly well in creating a car culture over the last 30, 40 years. So the car culture is very much embedded in our lives. If you think about it, quite often the car is the second biggest purchase that people make after a house. I mean, there's a transport poverty issue there, but you invest a lot in a car, and if you've invested a lot in a car, you're going to want to use it. So I think we're talking about culture change and behaviour change here. So we've got these very comfortable metal boxes to move about in. We need to create an environment where walking, cycling, public transport is even better. Going back to Brent Tadarian, he refers to making public transport delightful. I quite like that. We need to find ways of making the options further up the transport hierarchy delightful. And delight will be different for different people. So it might be the fresh air and the exercise. It might be because it's cheaper and easier. And it might be because you have you feel you've got a responsibility towards the environment. But we need to find out what the drivers are that are encouraging us all to still use these metal boxes, which make no sense. And we have the evidence that they don't make sense in many situations, to actually change our behaviour, change our values, change our behaviour, so that we choose not to use the car, but to walk and cycle and use public transport instead. And we're making great progress there, but we've got a long way to go, I think, in some ways, to actually encouraging people who are hefted to the car to actually leaving that nice metal box behind and saying, yeah, I'm going to walk to the school or to the shop, or let's take public transport on our holiday instead of the private car. But it's a long-term behaviour cultural change. And that's where the planning system, I think, can really help, because that is, the planning system can create the environment that allows us to make those better choices, which are becoming essential choices now as well as just better choices.
I love that, Ian. We need to make it delightful. That's the aspiration and having passion, not let's just get by here. Let's actually make it a choice that people want to make. And I remember seeing an advert in one of the Northern Europe countries of here is the person's car, they love their car, it's in their driveway, it's a Mercedes, it's this, but they choose to leave it at home and go to work on the bus. And I thought, wow, would we get an advert like that in the UK? That would be my aspiration. You may own your car. Ideally, I mean, it was a car advert, so it was going to still promote buying it, and that raises what Susan was saying about that car ownership, but it's almost making it a more appealing thing to get on the bus and to sell that instead of selling the car.
Irene, I think we're losing you.
As we see all the time on our televisions and advertising. Susan, I'll come on to you.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of the parking, I mean, I think what's been found to be outside retailers valuable elsewhere is to ask retailers to estimate what percentage of their customers they think come by car, and then to do a short survey and see how many do. And what's been found is, and there's many examples of this, retailers always overestimate the percentage of people that come by car and underestimate the percentage of people that come by walking and cycling. And that can be done in... Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah? So that can be a powerful way to actually demonstrate the benefits. And there are good examples of that written up in Living Streets, Pedestrians Pound Report, and also TfL, Transport for London, has got a really good slide pack on the economic benefits of active travel. And then in terms of the opposition to the active travel, sorry, getting some feedback there, I think. I've been astonished by the anti-feelings towards low traffic neighbourhoods. So my own borough in London is Islington, and they're going through a process of implementing people-friendly streets. And it's massive opposition to that. And people, I mean, it's in Hackney, the neighbouring borough, there's been those sorts of measures in for the last 40, 50 years, in Waltham Forest for the last 5 years, and people are reacting like it's something, you know, incredibly different, and it isn't. And I think the reaction is really extreme. And I think the clear thing is clear communication from the councils as to why they're doing this. But also, I think there has to be some political bravery. And the leader of my example of Islington Council, he's saying he knows he's going to get this flack. He knows it's from a minority. They're loud, they're vocal. They're actually, most of them are not in the borough. And you just have to weather that storm, because you know ultimately it's going to introduce change for the good. And we've seen that very strongly in Waltham Forest and in Hackney. And the politicians, I feel dreadfully sorry for them. So Councillor John Burke in Hackney recently received a death threat through the post to him and his family for what he's doing. And it makes it so hard for those politicians. But, you know, the ones who can be strong, and they are being strong because they know what they're doing is right. And there was a recent YouGov poll that showed that for every person who opposes the measures, there are 6.5 who support it. So it's being really clear that there is that level of support.
I guess Irene's having difficulties coming in, but maybe just make one other point, and that is, I think Mike referred to it as the preventative spend agenda, because I know resources are really important and are constrained, and there is the temptation to think there's no money for this. But actually, what we're talking about here, I believe strongly, is a net saving to the public purse. If we invest in active travel, public transport now, then we will save a huge amount in terms of public health costs, climate change mitigation. things associated with inequalities. So I think there's a long-term game here, which again fits into the planning system, in that it might cost a little now, but actually in the long term we will save a huge amount of money. I think we also need to allocate resources from more than just the transport budgets. This is a health issue, it's an inequalities issue, it's an environmental issue, and so those budgets within local authorities and nationally also need to be mobilised to help deliver more active travel and public transport.
For everyone, I'm Craig McLaren, Director of RTPI. We might have lost Irene, so we'll actually come to near the end of the session anyway. So all I'd really like to do on Irene's behalf, and I'm sure on behalf of everyone who's tuned in today, is just to say thanks very much to all our speakers. I think it's been a fascinating session. We've covered a lot of really interesting ground around behaviour change, around convincing and making the case for this work, around how place itself is an important aspect of that as well. So thanks very much to Susan, to Ian and to Mike for your contributions in terms of your presentations and also the Q&A as well. And thanks to everyone else for